Let's talk through each faction's duelists, brawlers and head takers, with a review of each faction's champions in Warhammer 40K. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking champion units, looking through each army in the game, and talking through everyone's version of a guy with a sword who steps up to lay low the enemy heroes if they happen to have one. Melee champion units do seem to be something that Games Workshop have been moving to create for a whole bunch of factions over the last few years. Kind of a cool archetype within an army, a character that's not really dedicated to battlefield command, but instead is just a consummate fighter, particularly good at slaying enemy heroes, and in 10th edition that's often realised with some sort of combination of precision attacks, maybe some advance or charge boosts to their units to get them where they need to be, and a fair few of them have the fights first rule or some sort of bodyguard ability to protect other characters in the units. Obviously there's a lot of different armies out there, and I feel like for this sort of archetype, some factions have something that fits into that kind of role a lot better than others. So for this particular video, I'm usually going to go with units that literally have the word champion in their name, or other infantry brawlers that attach to units, often with some sort of combination of precision attacks, and their primary draw is their melee might, and you wouldn't usually class them as leaders or captains to head up their army. They're more sort of the dedicated fight guy. With those kind of restrictions, there are quite a few armies that don't really have something that fits the bill perfectly, but if anything I was kind of surprised at the amount of factions that do if you look hard for them. For this one I thought we'd talk through each one of these powerful duelists, what they bring to the table for their factions, and a rough power rating for how good they are within each army, maybe a bit of a likelihood for how often they might be taken in competitive lists for that faction. Jumping straight into it, and for the Space Marines they have their Primaris Company champion. He briefly had an independent character datasheet, and I think that's still available in Legends, but now for the mainstay of the Marines they're folded into the company heroes. 4 guys with tanky 4 wound profiles and some good bodyguard rules with -1 to wound, who attach to a friendly captain or chapter master to try and stop them getting killed while they go about doing their duties. In the squad you get a specialist with a mastercrafted heavy bolter, a veteran with a fancy bolt rifle, an ancient whose banner gives you a little bit more objective control, and of course probably the most interesting is the company champion themselves. He is armed with a mastercrafted power weapon, 6 attacks hitting on a 2+ at strength 5, AP 2 and damage 2 with precision, at least a reasonable chance to slay an enemy character in a unit, but basically is the primary melee threat of the squad all by himself. It's not really the champion alone that sells the unit, more the combined offering for this one, but in general these guys absolutely do get used in competitive play. 16 wounds worth of Space Marine with -1 to wound is at least fairly chunky to chew through, and they're often seen as bodyguards for characters like Uriel Ventris or Vulcan Hestan, whose buffs can affect other units on the table, so it's nice to have them just be extra tough to deliver their combat profile into melee, or maybe do a weird combined unit with Marnius Calgar perhaps, and get a bit more melee threat with him and his Victrix guards. Probably their main competitors are the Assault Intercessors for 20 points cheaper and giving 4 wound rerolls to their characters if they're fighting on objectives. But these guys have a pretty good roll, and I've given them an 8 out of 10 for power. Space Marines have a lot of characters, and while maybe the trope isn't 100% one for one, I feel like the Judiciar is also worth a mention for champion style units. He is an attached character with precision and grants the fight's first special rule via that Tempora Mortis, and is particularly adept at head taking with that Executioner Relic Blade with precision and devastating wounds, and Silent Fury giving you extra attacks if he does manage to slay character models, proving his worth taking the heads of the enemy heroes on his routes to join the Reclusium. For the Judiciar, his melee profile is definitely worth something, though the fights first is the biggest draw to him. It means that if he's joining, say, a unit of Blade Guard or a unit of Inner Circle companions, the opponent just really can't easily charge them with a whole load of their units unless they want to get hit first, and that's kind of powerful in the mid-board against melee opponents and could make them really problematic to take down. It's quite good for heroic intervention as well. I've chosen to give him a 7 out of 10 overall. They do get used from time to time, though aren't auto-include. One of the main disadvantages is only being able to attach the one character if you put a Judiciar in the unit, so you can't get a lieutenant to buff the squad's damage, and you can't pair him with another fighty chapter master or something, which I think would be a massively dangerous unit if you could. Next up we've got perhaps the most iconic champion in Warhammer 40k in the Emperor's Champion. The Black Templars choose one of their own before battle to take the honour, swearing great vows to lay low the enemy's heroes and leaders. The Emperor's Champion is just 75 points, and for that cost he's an absolute menace. A fairly good defensive stat line with a 2+ save and a 4+ invulnerable, and then the Black Sword has got a crazy 6 attacks at strength 8, AP 3 and damage 3, all with precision, so kind of next level compared with the previous 2 champions that we'd seen there. And it also comes with a sweep mode as well for 10 attacks against hordes. Once per phase, he can blank a damage characteristic when he fails a save in melee, and he also gets a +1 to wound against character models as well. It means that he'll be usually wounding on a 2+ with the black sword against most normal ones, and even wounding on a 4 against big heavy things like Imperial Knights, if he does happen to be laying low some monstrous ones. He's particularly nice with Sword Brethren as well, as they can give him +1 damage, which means that even his sweep mode could be 10 attacks at strength 6, AP 2, damage 2 to take down some Space Marines, or the big strike could go up to damage 4. Overall massively scary and very easy to use for the Templars. I've given him a big 9 out of 10 here. Just as a quick aside before we continue, if you were looking to pick up any 40k miniatures of any sort, the channel has a bunch of affiliate discount retailers linked in the video description, which is one way of supporting Auspex tactics all around the world when buying models that you would have picked up anyway. There's Element Games in the UK, Gap Games in Australia, Fenris Workshop in Canada, Wargame Portal in the USA, and Tash and Geldeep in the EU, generally giving between 10 and 20% off Games Workshop's miniatures, and anything ordered through them, GW or not, goes to help to support the channel a little bit, so a big thank you to anyone picking up through them when you do order something in. Back to our parade of champions though. Next up for the Space Wolves, it kind of had to be Arjak Rotfist, the Terminator champion of the Space Wolves, and it's got some slight Thor vibes going on with his faux hammer, which, as well as putting the smackdown in the melee with 5 attacks at strength 8, AP 2 and damage 3 and an anti-monster 2+ keyword, he can also throw it for a single attack within 6 inches. Otherwise, for his leadership buff, he gets +1 to hit and +1 to wound if the squad takes casualties and then goes below half strength. So it can be an alright damage boost to a bigger Terminator unit, though I feel like buffs like that are a bit less reliable to activate than some out there. And he does take his character slaying very seriously, being able to reroll the hit roll and wound roll, and being able to use Epic Challenge for 0 CP to gain precision when he needs to. Overall, he certainly adds damage threat to a unit, and his damage buff is worth something even if it's a bit unreliable. I feel like he only really gets good against characters though for the 95 point cost, which is quite a lot more than say the Emperor's Champion that we just mentioned. He also just doesn't seem to make it into as many Space Wolf lists compared with some, given that people don't tend to use Wolfguard Terminators quite as much as some of their other melee specialists. It seems to be all about the Thunderwolves and Wolfen for more competitive lists at least. I still think he's usable though, even if he doesn't make it into all that many top tier armies. I've chosen to give him a 6.5 out of 10. He's definitely got a lot of threats, but at the same time he's got quite a high price tag, needs a specific unit that not every army wants to field, and even has competition there with all the other characters, including Logan Grimnar himself. Next up for the Dark Angels, the Deathwing champion was unfortunately removed, though the Ravenwing champion still persists. Like the company heroes, he's been folded into the sort of command squad that they have, so you buy 3 elite Black Knights for 130 points, and they can join a big Black Knight squad for an interesting power unit with some serious buffs going. Within that unit, the Apothecary can resurrect a slain model each turn. The Ancient's Banner gives all the bikers OC3, which is rather nice, and then the champion puts the smack down with the Mastercrafted power weapon, 6 attacks at strength 5, AP 2 and damage 2, +1 to advance and charge, and also able to use the heroic intervention stratagem for 0 CP. Though kind of interesting that he doesn't have the precision keyword unlike some. The advance and charge boost is kind of nice, certainly doesn't hurt the sheer speed of the Raven Wing as they're bringing their guns and power weapons to bear. In general, these command squads just add a whole ton of value to the Black Knight squads that they tend to run with, and are quite good at delivering them for the Alpha Strike and the Company of Hunters detachment. It still seems that the overall offering is maybe just a bit overcosted though, given that not many Dark Angels players are having much success with Raven Wing at the top tournament level. They can genuinely hit very hard with a scary amount of plasma fire, but then when they get counter-attacked can fold a bit easier than you'd like. For the Blood Angels, bar the core codex options, I wouldn't really say they've got clear champion units here. If I had to pick one, it'd probably be the Sanguinor, which might be the closest, though to my mind is not really a champion model, filling a bit of a different role as an angelic saviour lone operative, flying around and doing his own thing on vision. A pretty terrifying unit though, with his heroic intervention, fights first, and then being a fast and fighty lone operative when he is on the board. Will be interesting to see his points cost when they come out for the new Blood Angels codex. Otherwise, for Imperial armies that don't really have a clear option, the Adeptus Mechanicus don't really go in for brawler champion style characters, though I guess their tech priests do take some fun gear into battle. Maybe the Manipulus or Dominus with the new version of the Omni Sterilizer could be one that could deal a bit of damage above most. Also for the Sisters, despite having a serious amount of support characters, I feel like perhaps a direct one-to-one champion slayer isn't really an archetype that they have quite so directly as some. I think if it's anyone though, it's likely Ephrael Stern, though she does feel quite a bit different to most of the rest on the list, given that she's a lone operative with Kaiganel. Focusing on her just a little bit, she's 85 points, has fights first and precision melee with 4 attacks at strength 6 and damage 2. And then Kaiganil chips in with 6 attacks at strength 4, AP 2 and damage 1 for a little bit more horde style clearance. Otherwise they move fairly fast at 8 inches, have 8 wounds between them with their 4+ invulnerable save, can heroic intervene for free, and have a couple of rules that punish chaos specifically. Fights first does mean that they should be able to take at least a chunk out of infantry units that charge them too. As the go, I'd say they're okay for 85 points. I feel like it's just a little bit on the expensive side for a lone operative just for utility, and they don't really do all that much damage for the cost, even if they're not so easy to take down. I'd give them a 7 out of 10 for utility purposes. Besides them, for characters that are mainly there for their damage, the Palatines can often be very fighty with a couple of different enhancements in Hallowed Martyrs or Bringers of Flame. Given their buffing rules and lore though, they feel maybe a bit more of a lieutenant style character as opposed to a direct duelist one. For the Astra Militarum, they can hide a bit of chunky muscle in their units with an Ogren bodyguard, more of a meaty muscle minder as opposed to a precision fighter. But they can have a fair bit of chunky threat within a unit. You could give them a 4+ invulnerable save and a Bullgrim Maul, or go for a huge knife or any of the other Ogren equipment. They are only 40 points, and they're at least fairly tough for the cost with 6 wounds and a feel no pain. They've got a rule to give a feel no pain to any officers within the unit, and if those officers get injured, then he suddenly gets a big damage boost. Though that feels like a rule that would rarely trigger. I feel like his points and stats aren't actually terrible for the genuinely quite cheap 40 points that he costs, but he's often going to be joining a unit that doesn't enormously want to be in melee, and it kind of means that his raw might and damage profile there could be wasted, or if they aren't, then it means that the rest of the squad maybe isn't where it wants to be. As a result, I've given him a 5 out of 10. Genuinely not terrible stats for one of the cheapest characters in this list, but it's just kind of hard to incorporate into an army in an efficient way. I kind of have similar feelings about Nork Deadog, everyone's favourite unquestionably loyal Ogren. He basically feels like an improved version of the regular Ogren bodyguard. 60 points, so an extra 20 points there. A bit tougher with his 5+ feel no pain, and a bit more threatening in melee with devastating wounds on his huge knife, a ripper gun, and some mortal wound impact hits. Seems usable enough for the upgrade, but certainly always feels a bit take or leave to me versus say just getting another 10 infantry on the battle line. For the Adeptus Custodes, we've got the Blade Champion, 110 points worth of melee might, and a pretty scary force to have in the midst of a Custodian Guard or Warden squad, with 3 different profiles for their Vault Swords depending on what sort of enemies they need to try and take down. They've either got a Precision profile with 6 attacks at Strength 7, AP 2 and Damage 2, or a Victor's profile to take down heavies with 6 attacks at AP 3, Damage 3 and devastating wounds, which can be quite nice to help punch up a little bit against tanks and vehicles and things. With their Martial Qatar and Shield Host bonuses, they can also have lethal hits going off on a 5+, which makes that profile a lot scarier. In general, for that points cost, he just adds quite nicely to his unit's damage profile, and also helps them get there as well, allowing you to reroll charge rolls for a unit, plus a once per game advance and charge is really quite a big deal too. On that turn, a Warden squad would have around about an 18-inch charge threat range, which is quite nice for on-the-board infantry, and particularly really big, tough, scary ones in melee. As a result, he tends to be a pretty auto-include character for leading Custodians around, perhaps particularly Wardens, so I've given him a 9 out of 10 here. For the Grey Knights, they've got a couple of champion equivalent models, 80 points for the standard Brotherhood champion, a power armoured character if you want something to lead your Stripe Marines around. He's got fairly standard precision melee at 5 attacks at strength 6, AP 2 and damage 2, and grants fights first to his unit, and re-rolling hits and wounds against characters with his own model's melee attacks. I think 80 points for fights first and a bit of melee really isn't too bad, though it tends to be a kind of rare pick for tournament lists, given that most people try and build around either the Brotherhood Terminators or Paladins if you're going big investment on a squad, as opposed to things like Stripe Marines. I've given him a 6 out of 10 as a result. Castellan Crow is basically a boosted Brotherhood champion pretty much. He's 90 points since the points update, and he leads Purifiers about. He has a similar sort of melee profile to the Brotherhood champion with that Blade of Antwer, but gets devastating wounds, though his big thing is to augment the purifying flames of his Purifier units. He'll get +1 attack with those, so he could be spitting out really quite a lot of psychic damage there. He also comes with 3 of those attacks himself. That could be really quite a hefty shooting threat, along with Storm Bolters to clear out a whole load of light infantry in the enemy backfield, particularly if it's comboed with the 3-inch deep strike that they can do. At the last points update, he did go up a bit, kind of unexpectedly. He did get played, but certainly wasn't in every list. At 90 points though, I still think that he's usable for that. There was definitely a bigger investment than he was before. I've chosen to give him a 7 out of 10. For the Imperial agents, I guess the closest thing might be the Eversaw Assassin, Doesn't really feel like a champion in the traditional sense, but I suppose if we're going for dedicated melee characters and character killing, he fits the bill well enough. They got crazily boosted in the Imperial Agents Codex on the stats. He gets Precision, the big sustained hits 3, and also Advance and Charge all the time there. Plus goes into Friends on Rage mode once per game as well, kind of like an Imperial Solitaire with a ridiculous threat range between that and his scout moves. He does cost loads of points though, at around 110 points for the agents and 120 for allies, and that is quite a lot to ask for a 4 wound character with just a 4+ invulnerable save to protect him. He does need to achieve something important between his utility and his damage output. At the new cost he does feel really quite pricey, though it is very powerful being able to charge just that far across the board with some scary melee threat, and maybe give him around a 7 out of 10 rating or so. Finally for the Imperium, and I guess also for Chaos Knights, they don't really have characters in the traditional sense that aren't huge war machines, so I'm not sure how well they really fit into this video. I guess if we're going with the big knights as the characters, then it'll be a dedicated knight that's good at slaying other knights. Out of those I feel like the Knight Lancer might be one of the single most suited. It's got the shield to ward against other knightly close combat attacks with a 4+ save in combat, plus the big hitting lance profile wounds enemy super heavies on a 2+ as well. It does have a bit of a thing of being a more honourable duelist versus some of its peers. These guys are pretty strong for knights, both Imperial and Chaos versions. I chose to give him an 8 out of 10 for power here. Moving on to Chaos, and starting out with the standard Chaos Space Marines, most of their unit leaders are classed by champions, and they did have the Exalted Champion in their roster, though it did go to Legends in the last codex. I guess he tended to function a bit more as a more standard unit commander though. Otherwise though, we've got the warp-sighted butcher that is the Master of Executions, who I think is close enough to fit the role. The Chaos Headsman with that enormous axe, the Axe of Dismemberment having 5 attacks at Strength 7, AP 2 and Damage 2 with devastating wounds and precision. He generates a command point if he does manage to slay any character models, and he can also grant some pretty powerful rerolls to his unit as well, rerolling hit rolls if he attacks a unit below full strength, which isn't really the hardest thing to achieve with maybe a little bit of shooting fire, and then going up to reroll wounds as well if it's below half strength, potentially meaning that him plus a Chaos Lord plus a unit of Legionaries can be just ridiculously fighty between all the rerolls and the power weapon profiles they get. I would still rate him as kind of second place for a unit leader after the standard Chaos Lord though. Between the 3 stratagems, that Demon Hammer and the rather godly turn of boosted melee, I feel like he still has the edge overall. Though I still think that this guy's good. I rate him a 7.5 out of 10 overall. For the Death Guard, they don't really have dedicated brawler characters who isn't a more Lord status commander. I guess if you had to pick one, it might be Typhus or the Lord of Contagion, both of which are pretty fighty, and he certainly could have Typhus run completely solo if you wanted to. He's got a very scary Relic Man Reaper plus his mortal wound attack. Otherwise, like the Chaos Marines, again they have their unit leaders also designated champions, and I guess they are nasty enough for the Death Shroud and the Plague Marines. They don't really function in the same sort of character hunting, character kind of role. For the Emperor's Children in their tiny index, I thought Lucius the Eternal was worth a mention as well. Maybe a bit of a halfway character for him, given that he is a leader, but also does function very much as a duelist. That's kind of his whole thing. A 95-point Chaos Lord with 8 attacks at Strength 5, AP 2 and Damage 2, all with a precision keyword, and he gets 2 fights first, which he confers to his unit as well, so again can be a very scary unit in the midboard there. He does get a Doom Siren as well for basically a boosted heavy flamer, and he has his fun Armour of Shrieking Souls ability to deal some damage to whatever killed him. Overall for the 95 points I think he's alright. Fights first is great, and he does have a good dedicated melee profile. Declaring your army as Emperor's Children and having him in it though does have some downsides for the advantage of unlocking him though. For the demons, perhaps the single best example felt like Skulltaker, the Herald of Khorne. Again a leader that's all about cutting down enemy characters with his Slayer Sword. 6 attacks at Strength 6, AP 2 and Damage 3 with devastating wounds and precision, and he gives any Bloodletter squad that he's leading devastating wounds on their melee as well, which is nice for those Hell Swords to be punching up against tough stuff. Plus his own melee gets to reroll hits and wound rolls against character units, so that's going to be near guaranteed to stack a bunch of scary saves, never mind if he has other buffs coming in from things like a Rem Master. Overall I think for that combat profile and the anti-character abilities, I think he's very usable at 85 points. I've given him a 7.5 out of 10. Basically all the core melee stuff is rather good though. Next up for the World Eaters, we've also got their Master of Executions. He works a bit differently to the standard Chaos one. He still has a similar damage profile with that Axe of Dismemberment, but with the World Eater's charge buffs, it'll often be Strength 8 and 6 attacks when he goes rushing in. Plus, if he gets fielded, he often tends to take the Berserker Glaive enhancement that you can see here, +1 attacks and +1 damage. So on the charge, that'd be 7 attacks at Strength 8, damage 3, enough to cause at least some concern to basically anything on the game there. He rerolls hits and wounds against characters on top of that, all very nasty with devastating wounds and precision, and then his ability is that when he's leading a unit of Khorne Berserkers, they get to fight first, making them a very scary prospect to try and get to grips with in the midfield. Both if the enemy has melee units that needs to try and bring them down in close combat, or potentially if they do a bit of blood surging into melee with an enemy that's strayed a bit too close, being able to fight first with that certainly doesn't hurt, even if something else countercharged you at the same time. Overall, I've given him an 8 out of 10, not sure if that's being a little bit on the generous side here. His damage profile is scary, and fights first is really big, but at the same time with the relic, he's 125 points, so not really all that far off, buying you something extra like another squad of Exalted 8-bound or something, so you are making some big trade-offs if you're bringing one along. Finally for Chaos, we have the Thousand Sons, who don't really do honourable melee champions in any way, shape or form. I guess for damage dealer characters, the nearest they'd have would be things like the Infernal Master, with his nasty Psychic Torrent attack, but in general their sorcerers tend to operate all very dishonourably behind the lines, letting the Rupert Marines do all the dying while they concoct their schemes and magic missiles. For the Aeldari, various Phoenix Lords can fight pretty hard in close combat, though I feel like perhaps the single best fit for a champion-style unit is the Vizarch from the forces of the Inari. The champion of Inyad gives his unit the Fights First ability, probably normally going to be most meaningful on a troop of Harlequins, where you can attach that unit alongside Ivrain as well, make it a high investment but really quite a dangerous unit that the opponent would have to be seriously wary about attacking in melee. For his own damage profile, he gets 5 attacks with precision at strength 5, AP 4 and damage 2, getting either sustained hits 2, devastating wounds or lethal hits, depending on what would help him most. Though I feel like between that profile and those special rules, I wouldn't say he's the most standout melee damage dealer for 90 points. I think he probably realistically needed to either hit a bit harder or cost a little bit less. I've not really seen very many people running him in competitive lists at all, and I feel like if you are already taking Ivrain and a big Harlequin troop, that's already quite a big investment unit for something that's not really all that tough. I think for most people, adding an extra 90-point character into the mix is just a step a bit too far. Overall, for that reason, I've ranked him a 5.5 out of 10. Definitely not useless, and fights first can be really intimidating against the right army. But in an army that already has quite a lot of fragile units and not that many models on the table, I'd say that 90 points for this guy is likely going to be a bit much for most people. Next up, we've got Drazar, the Master of Blades of the Drukhari, a pretty cheap character at 75 points, and basically has the profile of a fallen Phoenix Lord. He's got 5 attacks hitting at strength 6, AP 2 and damage 3, all with devastating wounds, potentially being able to use a pain token for a bit more there. Or he can fight with an anti-horde style profile, getting twin linked, and then getting a bunch of attacks at strength 5, AP 2 and damage 2, which is quite nice for killing Space Marines and the like. All those attacks and any of the attacks of his Incubi charges also gets to add 1 to the wound roll as well. Quite a powerful boost given that their main disadvantage is that they've got kind of low strength on those clave blades, though it does have a bit of an overlap with the Drukhari Sky Splinter Assault formation, given that one of their main buffs there is the Lance keyword for a +1 to wound out of transports and things, though I guess it does mean that he can still have that with his units, even several turns after disembarking. Besides that, once per game he also gets Vicious Execution, precision for his own attacks when he wants to take out one enemy leader, and if he does manage to slay a character with that burst of attacks, he can generate some pain tokens, D3 for any regular character, and then 3 for a warlord as an alternative. Overall, for 75 points, he's got really quite good damage output and is fairly scary and usable. The main competition is whether or not he's better than a Drukhari Archon instead. They've got a few of their own advantages, particularly for the warlord one with the command point debuff aura. But in particular, their wound boosting thing tends to be better jumping out of transports, given that they allow rerolls to wounds, and that will stack with the lance rule from the disembarking thing in Sky Splinter, whereas Drazar's buffing rule doesn't. He does personally hit a lot harder though, which definitely has its advantages. Overall, I've given him an 8 out of 10 here. Otherwise for this one, the Tyranids maybe don't have a particularly perfect fit for a champion style unit. Out of their options, it might be somewhere between the Broodlord leading Genestealers, though he's pretty much a Genestealer alpha as opposed to a dedicated character slayer. the Winged Prime leading some warriors, or maybe Death Leaper. I feel like Death Leaper might be the best fit out of them. Precision attacks to take out enemy characters, fights first, and also having quite a lot more independent character sort of vibes versus the rest of the Tyranid units out there. It does feel like he might be the choice for the Tyranid stealthy duelist if you had to go with one. All the Tyranid's lone operatives tend to get played quite a lot in competitive lists, and Death Leaper's no exception. He's got pretty good threat for his 80-point cost with a bunch of strength 7 and damage 2 attacks, good durability for a lone operative with that chameleonic cape of his, and also can trigger a few more battle shock tests in the mid board if he's scrapping over a central objective, which definitely doesn't hurt. Overall, I'll give him an 8.5 out of 10 for power. I feel like for Tyranids, most armies tend to want at least some of their lone operatives on the table, though I feel like they're all kind of balanced with the different things that they do. Either very cheap rapid ingressing lictors, or a bit of synergy with battle shock and +1 to wound with neurolictors, or the slightly higher investment tanky and objective things that Death Leaper does. For the Genestealer Cults, I've gone with their champion bodyguard unit that is the Locust. He's 45 points, so is a pretty cheap support character, 3 wounds at toughness 4 and strikes with Locust blades, 5 attacks at strength 5, AP 2 and damage 2. He again comes with one of those rules to give feel no pain to character models within the unit, so can protect one of his charges a little bit better, though I feel like that doesn't come up all that often besides against precision. His main buffing rule is fights first though, which can be tricky to get to grips with some armies. Could be kind of nasty along with metamorphs in the midfield, making them a very tricky unit to approach, whether you're shooting them and they jump into melee, or you try and charge them and they get to hit you first. Fights first for 45 points really isn't the worst rule in the world. I feel like for acolytes and metamorphs though, it could be a luxury that they maybe can't quite afford all that well versus things that buff damage such as the biophages perhaps. I think they maybe struggle to have just the critical mass of threat that can really deter enemies from charging them, and they're really very fragile to any enemy shooting, and fights first isn't going to help too much if the squad just gets shot to bits. Overall though, between his melee profile and fights first, that's really not a bad deal for 45 points. I've chosen to give him a 6.5 out of 10, though I still think he's going to remain kind of niche. For the Orks, they don't really go in for champion style units, and having thought about it a little bit, I guess the reason they don't have some sort of character killer duelist Ork is that if you're the best at fighting for the boys, then generally you've wound up being the boss anyway. Orky politics, or being very much might is right, and showing the most respect for the guy who can most likely beat you to a pulp. I guess for that reason, things like the war bosses and beast bosses tend to both be the best fighter that'll seek out the enemy's heroes and biggest things, as well as being the actual overall commanders. For the Tau Empire, again maybe not quite so much on the characters that kill characters kind of front. Their battlesuit commanders generally tend to be ones that aren't going to be drawn into big one-on-one duels with some other faction's character, and are going to be very happy to just lay them low at a distance with all sorts of fancy plasma rifles and things. I suppose they did have Ornshi, the sort of duelist ethereal, in the previous version of the Index, but now he's gone. I guess Farsight will be the next closest. I wouldn't really say that he feels particularly like an army champion though as he goes. He just happens to be the guy in charge and just enjoys a bit of melee combat with that sinister Dawnblade that he carries. Though it's definitely a fun and effective unit, maybe best placed drop in with Retaliation Cadre within 3 inches, discounting stratagems and giving a +1 to wound, and maybe helping break some enemies alongside some Sunforge suits perhaps. Next up, we've got the Ironhair Champion for the Leagues of Votann. I wouldn't necessarily say that the Votann heroes and characters are standout ones, maybe having a little bit more emphasis on their more mainline units than the characters, though the Ironhair Champion does maybe seem to be the single choice that's fielded the most. Ironhair Hearthguard are one of their most powerful units, dropping in and dousing the enemy in a whole bunch of Vulcanite and Concussion Gauntlet attacks. I think it's perhaps more the case that they just more need a character as their -1 to wound depends on it, so it usually means that it is worth the price to take a Carl or Champion along. In any case though, for 60 points he definitely does add a fair bit. He has a Mass Hammer for 3 attacks at Strength 12, AP 2 and Damage D6 +1. Not too bad to maybe round out the unit a bit more against heavy stuff, as they'll generally have the lighter stuff covered with those Concussion Gauntlets. He allows the squad to re-roll charges, which isn't the worst thing to have coming out of Deep Strike. He can grant the unit Deep Strike if they don't already have it from their Thane's Crest. Most people take the 4+ Invulnerable save on him, and then when he makes combat he also gets big mortal wound impact hits, usually D3 on the charge. The leagues have got a few good enhancements as well, maybe particularly the one for reassigning judgment once your unit's destroyed one can be quite good for Hearthguard, given that they're often quite likely to be taking out big enemy threats. In any case, he's a pretty cheap, solid and fighty HQ, very often being run in competitive armies alongside Hearthguard, either jumping out of land fortresses or deep striking in. I've chosen to give him an 8 out of 10 overall. Finally, that just leaves us with one faction left, and that's the Necrons. And again, they maybe feel like they're an army that's had their champion style model taken away and gone to legends. Most of the rest are either lords of one sort or another, so more sort of commanding figures, or cryptek support, or lesser nobles. Even if his data sheet is legends now, Vargard Oberon feels like the best example of a Necron champion style unit. He often might compared with Nemesis Zandrek to protect him against all foes. He's armed with a war scythe for a bunch of strength 8, AP 3 and damage 2 attacks with devastating wounds and precision, and gives his unit the Fights First ability, which could be pretty intimidating to make a unit of Lichguard hard to deal with. It's not used in tournament games or featuring in the codex these days, though his Legends points value is 85 points if you are playing more casually. And I wouldn't say that he is a particularly standout unit if so. Fights First is good, but I feel like Lichguard don't generally tend to be the unit that get built around in a really big way. 80 points just maybe feels like it's a bit too much of a tax to pay for it, even if he does come with a little bit of fighting melee built in on his own purposes. Still probably feels like the best example of a Necrons champion that we've got though. In any case, I'll leave that there for this one. Hope you've enjoyed a brief roundup of some of the best duelists and head takers of the various different factions of 40k, plenty of which are pretty relevant threats to their different factions. I'd say out of any of them, the Emperor's Champion I still think is pretty spectacular value for the 75 points, and the Custodes Blade Champion feels like he really stands out as well. Just hard to go too far wrong with extra speed and extra damage and a unit of Wardens. Let me know what you make of them and how you'd rate them against each other down in the comments. As mentioned, if you were looking to pick up any 40k kits, whether they might be mighty heroes or all manner of other things, feel free to check out the links in the video description below. All the channel discount retailers can save a good amount of money versus buying through Games Workshop direct, and of course help to support the channel and keep the videos coming. A massive thank you to any of you out there using those. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, and I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, for any of you who'd like to help out the channel a bit more directly, I do have a Patreon page as well, which is my main reason that I can do this full time. That's linked in the video description, and channel patrons do get a fair few rewards, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the big prize giveaways each month with a chance to win some big model kits. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.